behind the golden gates and crimson curtains of Windmere Palace, where tradition weighs heavier than the crown jewels themselves, three powerful women are about to reshape the very foundation of the monarchy. What begins as whispered conversations in marble hallways will explode into a battle that threatens to tear apart centuries of royal protocol. When Queen Consort Cordelia makes a move that blindsides Princess Catherine, it sets off a chain reaction that will force Prince William to choose between family loyalty and his future throne. In a world where every glance is analyzed and every gesture carries the weight of nations, one bold decision will change everything. The palace walls have kept secrets for generations, but some truths are too explosive to contain. The morning fog clung to the ancient stone walls of Windmere Palace like a shroud of secrecy, and inside the grand corridors, an equally mysterious atmosphere pervaded the royal household. Queen Consort Cordelia stood at the towering windows of her private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. At 68, she had learned that power in the palace was not always worn on one's head like a crown, but rather wielded through careful strategy and precise timing. The ornate clock on her mahogany desk chimed 9 times, and, right on schedule, her private secretary knocked softly before entering. "Your Majesty, the morning briefings are ready for your review." Cordelia turned from the window, her steel-gray hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. She had been awake since dawn, not because duty demanded it, but because sleep had become elusive since discovering certain information that could reshape the royal family's future. The briefings contained the usual matters of state, charity patronages, and upcoming engagements, but hidden beneath the routine paperwork was a single document that had kept her mind racing for days. As she reviewed the papers, her thoughts drifted to Princess Catherine, the beloved wife of Prince William and future queen. Catherine had won the hearts of the people with her grace, intelligence, and genuine warmth. She represented everything modern about the monarchy while still honoring its traditions. But what the public didn't know, what even William remained unaware of, was that Catherine had been quietly building her own network of influence within the palace walls. The discovery had come quite by accident. Cordelia's longtime confidant, Lady Margaret Ashworth, had mentioned observing unusual meetings between Catherine and several key palace staff members. Initially, Cordelia had dismissed it as Catherine simply being thorough in her royal duties. However, further discreet investigation revealed something far more sophisticated. Catherine was systematically identifying inefficiencies in royal operations and developing proposals for modernization that could fundamentally alter how the monarchy functioned. What truly intrigued Cordelia was not Catherine's ambition, but her approach. Unlike others who might seek to climb the royal hierarchy through political maneuvering or media manipulation, Catherine was focusing on genuine reform. Her proposals included everything from streamlining charitable foundations to implementing more transparent financial practices for royal estates. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership that Cordelia believed the monarchy needed, but it also represented a direct challenge to established protocols that had governed palace life for decades. The irony was not lost on Cordelia. For years, courtiers and media commentators had speculated about potential tensions between the queen consort and the future queen. Royal watchers expected competition, rivalry, or at least polite distance between women in their positions. Instead, Cordelia found herself genuinely impressed by Catherine's vision and increasingly convinced that supporting her could benefit everyone involved. The challenge lay in the fact that Catherine's reforms would necessarily diminish the influence of several longtime palace advisors who had grown comfortable with the status quo. These were men and women who had served the royal family for decades, accumulating power and perks that came with their positions. They viewed any change as a threat to their carefully constructed sphere of influence, and they had already begun subtle campaigns to undermine Catherine's initiatives. Lord Harrison Blackwell, the palace's senior advisor and a man who had served 3 monarchs, was leading this resistance. During a recent meeting of the Privy Council, He had made what seemed like innocent comments about the importance of preserving royal traditions and maintaining the dignity of established protocols. To most observers, these appeared to be standard conservative viewpoints. Cordelia, however, recognized them as coded criticism of Catherine's modernization efforts. The situation reached a turning point during a supposedly routine meeting about upcoming state visits. Catherine had prepared a comprehensive presentation about how the palace could improve its international relations through enhanced digital diplomacy and more strategic media engagement. Her research was thorough, her arguments compelling, and her proposed implementations practical. Yet when she finished speaking, Lord Blackwell dismissed her suggestions with a patronizing smile, claiming that such modern approaches might be appropriate for business, but royal diplomacy requires a more nuanced understanding of tradition. Cordelia had watched Catherine's face during this exchange, noting the flash of frustration that the younger woman quickly masked with professional composure. It was in that moment that Cordelia made her decision. The monarchy's survival in the modern world would depend not on rigid adherence to outdated practices, but on its ability to evolve while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. Catherine understood this instinctively, while many of the current advisors seemed determined to resist any meaningful change. The plan that began forming in Cordelia's mind was both bold and risky. Rather than allow the traditional power structure to slowly erode Catherine's influence, she would actively support the princess's modernization efforts while simultaneously outmaneuvering those who opposed them. This would require careful coordination, absolute discretion, and a willingness to challenge relationships that had defined palace dynamics for years. The first step was establishing direct communication with Catherine without alerting the existing power structure. Cordelia accomplished this by requesting a private meeting to discuss upcoming charity events, a perfectly normal interaction that would raise no suspicions. When Catherine arrived at the Queen Consort study, she clearly expected a routine discussion about patronages and public appearances. Instead, Cordelia began with an unexpected question. "Catherine, what do you believe is the greatest threat facing the monarchy in the next decade?" The princess paused, clearly surprised by the directness of the inquiry. After a moment of consideration, she responded thoughtfully, "I believe our greatest risk is becoming irrelevant to the people we serve. If we fail to adapt to changing social expectations while maintaining our core values, we risk losing the public trust that legitimizes our existence." It was exactly the answer Cordelia had hoped to hear, demonstrating that Catherine's reform efforts stemmed from genuine concern for the monarchy's welfare rather than personal ambition. From that point, the conversation evolved into something neither woman had expected, a strategic planning session that would reshape the palace's future direction. Cordelia shared her observations about the resistance Catherine was facing, making it clear that she understood the political dynamics at play. She also revealed her own growing concerns about the palace's reluctance to embrace necessary changes. Most importantly, she offered something Catherine had not anticipated: active support from the Queen Consort herself. The alliance they forged that afternoon was based on mutual respect and shared vision rather than convenience or political necessity. Both women recognized that their collaboration would face significant opposition and would require them to navigate complex relationships within the palace hierarchy. However, they also understood that the monarchy's long-term survival might depend on their willingness to challenge the status quo. As their meeting concluded, Cordelia made a commitment that surprised even herself. "Catherine, I want you to know that you have my complete support in implementing the reforms you proposed. Moreover, I intend to use every resource at my disposal to ensure their success. This family's future depends on leaders who understand both tradition and progress, and you clearly embody both qualities." Catherine's response revealed the grace and intelligence that had made her so beloved by the public. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply grateful for your confidence. However, I want to be certain that we're proceeding in a way that strengthens rather than divides the family. These changes must benefit everyone, not create winners and losers." It was a wise perspective that reinforced Cordelia's confidence in their partnership. As Catherine left the study, both women understood that they had crossed a threshold. The palace's political landscape was about to shift dramatically, and those who had grown comfortable with the existing order would soon discover that change was not only possible, but inevitable. The remainder of Cordelia's day was spent in careful planning. She reviewed Catherine's reform proposals in detail, identifying which initiatives could be implemented immediately and which would require more strategic preparation. She also began considering which allies they would need to cultivate and which opponents they would need to neutralize or circumvent. By evening, as she prepared for dinner with the extended royal family, Cordelia felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. The careful, incremental approach that had characterized much of her royal service was about to give way to something far more dynamic. The palace was about to discover that the queen consort and the future queen shared not only a commitment to the monarchy's welfare, but also the strategic intelligence necessary to ensure its continued relevance in a rapidly changing world. Part 2. The strategic foundation. The following weeks transformed Windermere Palace from a symbol of tradition into a carefully orchestrated center of quiet revolution. Queen Consort Cordelia and Princess Catherine had established a communication system that operated parallel to the palace's formal channels, allowing them to coordinate their efforts without alerting those who might oppose their initiatives. Their alliance, while still unknown to most of the royal household, began producing tangible results that surprised even seasoned palace observers. Catherine's approach to implementing change revealed the depth of her preparation and political acumen. Rather than attempting to overhaul entire systems at once, she focused on specific improvements that would demonstrate the value of modernization without threatening established positions unnecessarily. Her first target was the palace's charitable foundation management, an area where inefficiencies had become so endemic that even conservative advisors acknowledged the need for improvement. The royal family's charitable work represented one of their most important public functions, involving dozens of organizations and millions of pounds in donations and fundraising. However, the administrative systems supporting these efforts had remained essentially unchanged for decades, resulting in redundant processes, unclear accountability, and missed opportunities for greater impact. Catherine proposed consolidating overlapping functions, implementing digital tracking systems, and establishing clearer metrics for measuring charitable effectiveness. What made her approach particularly clever was its emphasis on enhancing rather than replacing existing structures. Rather than eliminating positions, she suggested redistributing responsibilities to make better use of staff expertise. Instead of criticizing past methods, she framed her proposals as building upon successful foundations. This diplomatic approach made it difficult for opponents to argue against her initiatives without appearing to oppose improved charitable outcomes. Cordelia's support proved crucial in navigating the political complexities that accompanied even these carefully designed changes. Her decades of experience in palace politics allowed her to identify potential sources of resistance before they could organize effective opposition. When Lord Blackwell attempted to raise concerns about rushed modernization during a senior staff meeting, Cordelia was prepared with detailed responses that demonstrated the careful consideration behind each proposed change. The Queen Consort's intervention went beyond mere verbal support. She used her authority to ensure that Catherine's reform committees received the administrative assistance they needed to develop comprehensive implementation plans. She also leveraged her relationships with longtime palace staff members to build support for changes that might otherwise have faced bureaucratic obstruction. Most importantly, she provided Catherine with access to historical precedents that strengthened the case for modernization. As their collaboration deepened, both women discovered that their partnership offered advantages neither had anticipated. Catherine's fresh perspective and systematic approach complemented Cordelia's institutional knowledge and political experience. Together, they could address challenges that had stymied previous reform efforts because they combined innovative thinking with practical understanding of palace dynamics. The charitable foundation consolidation became their first major success story. Within 6 weeks of implementation, the new systems had eliminated duplicate administrative functions, reduced operational costs by 15%, and increased the efficiency of donation processing. More importantly, these improvements freed up resources that could be redirected toward direct charitable activities, resulting in measurable increases in the foundation's impact on supported causes. The success of this initial project provided Cordelia and Catherine with the credibility they needed to pursue more ambitious reforms. Their next target was the palace's media relations strategy, an area where traditional approaches were increasingly inadequate for reaching modern audiences. Catherine's research had identified significant opportunities to enhance the royal family's public engagement through strategic use of digital platforms and more authentic communication styles. However, modernizing media relations would require challenging the authority of Sir Geoffrey Patterson, the palace's longtime press secretary, who had built his career on carefully controlled traditional media relationships. Patterson viewed social media and direct public communication as threats to the careful messaging strategies that had protected the royal family's reputation for decades. He particularly opposed Catherine's suggestions for more spontaneous public interactions and less formal communication styles. The conflict came to a head during a meeting about upcoming public engagements, where Catherine proposed incorporating more impromptu interactions with the public during official visits. Patterson argued that such unscripted moments created unnecessary risks and could undermine the dignity of royal appearances. His opposition was supported by several other traditional advisors who shared his preference for highly controlled public presentations. Cordelia recognized this as a defining moment for their reform efforts. If they backed down in the face of traditional opposition, their credibility would be damaged and future initiatives would face increased resistance. However, direct confrontation could fracture the palace's working relationships and potentially create public speculation about internal conflicts. The solution required the kind of strategic thinking that had made Cordelia one of the monarchy's most effective behind-the-scenes operators. Rather than engaging in public debate about media strategies, Cordelia arranged for Princess Catherine to participate in a carefully planned test case that would demonstrate the value of more authentic public engagement. She coordinated with Catherine to schedule an unannounced visit to a local community center during a previously planned charity event. The visit would appear spontaneous to observers, but would actually be thoroughly prepared to ensure positive outcomes. The community center visit exceeded even their optimistic expectations. Catherine's natural warmth and genuine interest in the people she met created moments of authentic connection that traditional royal appearances rarely achieved. Social media posts from attendees generated overwhelmingly positive responses, while traditional media coverage emphasized the princess's relatability and genuine concern for community issues. Most importantly, the event demonstrated that more relaxed royal interactions could enhance rather than diminish the monarchy's public image. The success of this approach provided Cordelia and Catherine with the evidence they needed to advocate for broader changes in royal communication strategies. Sir Geoffrey Patterson found himself unable to argue against results that had clearly benefited the royal family's public standing. Moreover, other palace staff members began recognizing that the Queen Consort and Princess Catherine's collaborative approach was producing measurable improvements in royal effectiveness. As word of their successful partnership began circulating through palace corridors, Cordelia and Catherine attracted support from unexpected quarters. Younger staff members who had been frustrated by resistance to modernization saw opportunities to contribute to meaningful improvements. Some senior advisors who had remained neutral in previous debates began expressing interest in participating in reform initiatives. Even some traditional supporters began acknowledging that carefully managed change could strengthen rather than weaken royal institutions. However, success also intensified opposition from those who viewed any change as a threat to their established positions. Lord Blackwell began organizing informal resistance among conservative advisors, arguing that rapid modernization could undermine the monarchy's stability and traditional authority. His concerns were shared by several longtime courtiers who had built their careers around maintaining existing protocols and were reluctant to adapt to new approaches. The growing polarization within the palace created an increasingly complex political environment that would require careful navigation. Cordelia understood that their next moves would determine whether their reform efforts could continue gaining momentum or would face organized resistance that could threaten both their initiatives and their working relationships within the royal household. As the second phase of their collaboration concluded, both women recognized that they had crossed another threshold. Their partnership had evolved from a shared commitment to modernization into a strategic alliance capable of reshaping palace operations. However, they also understood that their growing success would inevitably provoke more determined opposition from those who preferred traditional approaches to royal governance. The stage was set for a more direct confrontation between competing visions of the monarchy's future, and the outcome would depend on their ability to maintain unity while navigating increasingly complex political challenges within the palace walls. Part 3. The opposition strikes back. The third month of Queen Consort Cordelia and Princess Catherine's collaboration marked a turning point that neither woman had fully anticipated. Their success in modernizing charitable operations and media relations had generated enthusiasm among progressive palace staff members, but it had also crystallized opposition from traditionalist advisors who viewed their reforms as fundamental threats to established royal order. What began as subtle resistance was about to evolve into direct confrontation that would test both their alliance and their political skills. Lord Harrison Blackwell had spent weeks building a coalition of senior advisors who shared his concerns about the pace and scope of changes occurring within the palace. His group included Sir Geoffrey Patterson, whose authority over media relations had been challenged by Catherine's communication initiatives, Lady Victoria Pemberton, who oversaw royal protocol and viewed modernization as a threat to ceremonial traditions, and several longtime courtiers who had accumulated influence through decades of service under previous monarchs. Their opposition strategy was sophisticated and multi-layered. Rather than directly challenging individual reforms, they focused on broader concerns about institutional stability and the dangers of abandoning proven methods for untested approaches. They emphasized their collective experience and portrayed themselves as guardians of royal tradition who understood risks that younger, less experienced voices might overlook. The first sign of organized resistance emerged during a routine meeting of the Royal Household Council, the advisory body responsible for major palace operations. Catherine had prepared a presentation about expanding their successful community engagement model to other royal activities, including state visits and ceremonial events. Her proposal included detailed research about public expectations, media analysis of successful royal interactions, and specific recommendations for enhancing the monarchy's connection with modern audiences. However, when Catherine began her presentation, she encountered an unexpected level of coordinated questioning that went far beyond normal advisory discussions. Lord Blackwell opened with concerns about maintaining appropriate royal dignity in less formal settings. Lady Pemberton followed with detailed questions about protocol implications that seemed designed to highlight potential complications rather than seek solutions. Sir Patterson raised issues about media management that ignored the documented success of their recent initiatives. What became clear to both Catherine and Cordelia, who was observing the proceedings, was that this questioning represented more than routine advisory caution. The traditional faction had prepared a systematic challenge to modernization efforts that questioned not just specific proposals, but the entire philosophy underlying reform initiatives. They were essentially arguing that the monarchy's strength lay in maintaining traditional approaches that had sustained the institution through previous challenges. Cordelia recognized the political sophistication of this opposition strategy. By focusing on institutional concerns rather than personal conflicts, the traditional faction was positioning themselves as responsible guardians of royal welfare rather than self-interested opponents of change. This approach made it difficult to challenge their arguments without appearing to dismiss legitimate concerns about the monarchy's stability and continuity. The meeting concluded without resolution, but the battle lines had been clearly drawn. Catherine's proposals were referred to a special committee for further consideration, a bureaucratic maneuver that effectively delayed implementation while providing opponents with opportunities to organize additional resistance. More concerning was the signal this sent to other palace staff members about the political risks of supporting modernization efforts. In the days following the council meeting, Cordelia and Catherine found themselves navigating an increasingly complex political environment. Staff members who had previously expressed enthusiasm for reform initiatives became more cautious in their support, unwilling to risk their positions by openly opposing traditional advisors. Some reform supporters began hedging their commitments, while others withdrew from modernization committees entirely. The traditional faction capitalized on this uncertainty by initiating what they termed a comprehensive review of all recent changes to palace operations. While presented as a routine evaluation process, this review was actually designed to identify problems or complications that could be attributed to modernization efforts. Every minor administrative issue, scheduling conflict, or procedural question was scrutinized for evidence that reforms were creating more problems than they solved. Perhaps most damaging was the traditional faction's success in raising questions about the collaboration between Cordelia and Catherine themselves. While they couldn't directly criticize the queen consort or the future queen, they could express concerns about informal decision-making processes that bypassed established advisory channels. They argued that important changes required broader consultation and more careful consideration of potential consequences. These arguments found receptive audiences among staff members who felt excluded from reform planning or threatened by proposed changes. Administrative personnel who feared their positions might be eliminated or restructured began supporting calls for more conservative approaches to institutional change. Even some modernization supporters began questioning whether the pace of change was appropriate for an institution as complex and tradition-bound as the monarchy. The pressure intensified when several prominent royal historians and constitutional experts were invited to provide external assessments of recent palace changes. While their evaluations were generally positive, they included carefully worded cautions about maintaining appropriate balance between tradition and innovation. These expert opinions were seized upon by traditional advisors as validation of their concerns about hasty modernization. Cordelia found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Her support for Catherine's reforms had been based on genuine conviction that modernization was necessary for the monarchy's continued relevance and effectiveness. However, the organized opposition was threatening to create lasting divisions within the palace that could undermine royal unity and effectiveness regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed. The crisis deepened when Lord Blackwell requested a private audience with Cordelia to express his concerns directly. During this meeting, he presented what he characterized as a balanced assessment of recent changes that acknowledged some benefits while emphasizing significant risks. His presentation was professionally prepared and diplomatically delivered, making it difficult to dismiss as mere resistance to change. Blackwell's core argument was that the monarchy's strength had always derived from its stability and predictability in an uncertain world. He acknowledged that some modernization was inevitable and potentially beneficial, but argued that the current pace of change was creating uncertainty that could undermine public confidence. He particularly emphasized the dangers of appearing to abandon traditional values that many citizens viewed as essential elements of royal identity. Most concerning to Cordelia was Blackwell's suggestion that the collaboration between herself and Catherine was creating confusion about decision-making authority within the palace. He argued that bypassing established advisory processes, even with good intentions, set precedents that could undermine institutional governance. He urged Cordelia to consider slowing the pace of reform and ensuring that all changes receive comprehensive review by appropriate advisory bodies. The political sophistication of this approach put Cordelia in a challenging position. Blackwell was not demanding that reforms be abandoned, merely that they be implemented more gradually and with broader consultation. His arguments appeared reasonable and responsible, making it difficult to reject them without appearing reckless or dismissive of legitimate institutional concerns. However, Cordelia also recognized that this apparent reasonableness masked a strategy designed to stall modernization efforts indefinitely. The comprehensive review processes that Blackwell advocated could easily become bureaucratic obstacles that prevented any meaningful change. Moreover, requiring broader consultation for every initiative would give traditional advisors veto power over reforms that threatened their established positions. The situation reached a critical point when Catherine requested an urgent meeting with Cordelia to discuss their response to the organized opposition. The princess had become increasingly frustrated with the bureaucratic obstacles being placed in the path of reform initiatives, and she was beginning to question whether their collaborative approach was sustainable in the face of determined resistance. Catherine's concerns went beyond mere political frustration. She was genuinely worried that the current conflict was creating divisions within the palace that could ultimately damage the royal family's effectiveness and public standing. She had observed increased tension among staff members, declining morale among reform supporters, and growing uncertainty about the palace's future direction. Most importantly, Catherine was beginning to receive indirect messages suggesting that her modernization efforts were being viewed by some as inappropriate ambition that exceeded her proper role within the royal hierarchy. While no one had made such accusations directly, the implications were clear. Continued pursuit of reforms could be characterized as overreach that violated traditional expectations about royal behavior. As Cordelia and Catherine met to discuss their response to these challenges, both women understood that they faced a defining moment for their partnership and their reform agenda. The traditional faction had succeeded in transforming what had begun as collaborative modernization efforts into a political battle that threatened to create lasting divisions within the palace. Their next decisions would determine whether their vision for a modernized monarchy could survive organized opposition, or whether traditional approaches would continue to dominate royal operations for years to come. Part 4. The Royal Resolution, the final confrontation between tradition and modernization within Windermere Palace, arrived sooner than either Queen Consort Cordelia or Princess Catherine had anticipated. What forced their hand was an unexpected external pressure that made their internal political maneuvering suddenly secondary to a much larger crisis facing the entire monarchy. A series of investigative articles by prominent royal correspondent Sarah Mitchell had begun exposing inefficiencies and outdated practices within royal operations, threatening to create a public relations disaster that could undermine the monarchy's credibility with the very people it served. Mitchell's articles, published in the London Herald over consecutive weeks, detailed problems that Cordelia and Catherine had been working to address through their modernization efforts. The journalist had somehow gained access to information about redundant charitable administrative costs, missed opportunities for public engagement, and communication strategies that seemed increasingly out of touch with contemporary expectations. Most damaging were her revelations about internal resistance to reform efforts that portrayed the palace as an institution more concerned with preserving insider privileges than serving public interests. The external scrutiny created an immediate crisis that transcended the internal political battles between traditional and modernist factions. Suddenly, the palace faced unified pressure to demonstrate that it was capable of effective self-governance and responsive to legitimate public concerns. The traditional faction's arguments about maintaining stability became irrelevant when stability itself was threatened by public perception of institutional dysfunction. Prince William's entry into the conflict marked a crucial turning point that would reshape all previous political calculations. As heir to the throne and Catherine's husband, William had remained largely neutral in the modernization debates, focusing on his own royal duties while allowing palace administrators to manage internal operations. However, the public scrutiny created by Mitchell's articles forced him to take a more active role in determining the monarchy's response to criticism. William's perspective brought a unique combination of personal stakes and constitutional responsibility to the crisis. As Catherine's husband, he was naturally supportive of her efforts to modernize royal operations and understood her genuine commitment to improving the monarchy's effectiveness. However, as the future king, he was also concerned about maintaining institutional stability and avoiding changes that might weaken royal authority or create unnecessary political controversies. His intervention began with a series of private meetings with key figures from both traditional and modernist factions. William's approach demonstrated political maturity that surprised even experienced palace advisors, as he focused on identifying common ground rather than choosing sides in existing conflicts. He acknowledged legitimate concerns about institutional stability while also recognizing the necessity of adapting to changing public expectations. Most significantly, William reframed the entire debate by emphasizing the monarchy's fundamental responsibility to serve the British people effectively. Rather than viewing tradition and modernization as competing values, he presented them as complementary aspects of successful royal governance. Traditional values provided stability and continuity, while modern approaches ensured relevance and effectiveness. The challenge was finding the right balance rather than choosing between extremes. This perspective provided Cordelia and Catherine with exactly the framework they needed to overcome the bureaucratic resistance that had been stalling their reform efforts. William's support gave their modernization initiatives the constitutional authority they required to proceed without appearing to challenge established royal hierarchy. More importantly, his involvement demonstrated that reform efforts had backing from the very top of the royal succession. The breakthrough came during a comprehensive palace meeting that William convened to address the crisis created by external scrutiny. Rather than allowing the meeting to become another platform for factional debates, William presented a unified response strategy that incorporated elements from both traditional and modernist approaches. The plan acknowledged the value of established protocols while implementing specific improvements that would address legitimate public concerns. Catherine's role in this resolution demonstrated her political sophistication and genuine commitment to royal service rather than personal ambition. Rather than claiming victory over traditional opponents, she presented her reform proposals as collaborative solutions that would strengthen rather than weaken royal institutions. She acknowledged concerns raised by traditional advisors while explaining how modernization efforts could address those concerns more effectively than maintaining status quo approaches. The comprehensive reform package that emerged from these discussions was more ambitious than anything Catherine and Cordelia had originally envisioned, but it was also more politically sustainable because it had broad support across palace factions. Traditional advisors found themselves unable to oppose initiatives that had explicit backing from the future king and were presented as strengthening rather than challenging royal traditions. Lord Blackwell's response to the final reform package revealed both his political sophistication and his ultimate commitment to royal service over factional interests. While he maintained some reservations about specific changes, he acknowledged that external pressures required institutional adaptation and pledged his support for implementations that would enhance royal effectiveness. His cooperation was crucial for ensuring that reforms could be implemented without creating lasting divisions among palace staff. The modernization program that was ultimately implemented exceeded even Cordelia and Catherine's original goals while maintaining the institutional stability that traditional advisors had sought to preserve. Charitable operations were streamlined and made more transparent. Media relations were enhanced through strategic use of modern communication platforms, and public engagement was increased through more authentic and accessible royal interactions. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis had established new precedents for palace governance that balanced traditional authority structures with more collaborative decision-making processes. Catherine's role as a reform leader was formally recognized, providing her with the institutional authority necessary to continue modernization efforts as she prepared for her eventual role as queen. The external validation of their approach came when Sarah Mitchell published a follow-up article acknowledging the palace's comprehensive response to her initial criticisms. She noted that the speed and thoroughness of implemented reforms demonstrated genuine commitment to institutional improvement rather than mere public relations management. Her positive assessment helped restore public confidence in the monarchy's ability to govern itself effectively. As the dust settled from months of internal political maneuvering and external scrutiny, Cordelia reflected on how the crisis had ultimately strengthened both her relationship with Catherine and the monarchy's long-term prospects. Their collaboration had evolved from a tactical alliance into a strategic partnership that would continue shaping royal operations for years to come. Catherine's emergence as a recognized modernization leader positioned her perfectly for her future role as queen, while also establishing precedents that would allow future royal spouses to contribute meaningfully to institutional governance. The reforms they had implemented provided the monarchy with more effective tools for serving public interests while maintaining the dignity and continuity that made royal institutions valuable. The final meeting between Cordelia and Catherine following the resolution of their modernization crisis was notably different from their first strategic planning session months earlier. Instead of discussing how to overcome opposition to change, they focused on managing success and ensuring that implemented reforms would continue producing positive results. Their conversation revealed mutual respect that had deepened through shared challenges and collaborative achievements. Prince William's role in the resolution had demonstrated his readiness for future royal responsibilities while also establishing his support for Catherine's continued involvement in palace governance. The precedent of royal collaboration between the Queen Consort and future Queen created new possibilities for institutional effectiveness that transcended traditional hierarchical limitations. As evening fell over Windermere Palace, with its ancient stones now housing thoroughly modern administrative systems, Cordelia stood once again at her study windows watching the gardeners tend to roses that had bloomed for centuries. The palace had changed dramatically during recent months, but it remained fundamentally the same institution that had served the British people through countless previous transformations. The difference was that this transformation had been managed collaboratively, with full awareness of both traditional values and contemporary requirements. The monarchy was stronger because it had demonstrated its capacity for thoughtful evolution rather than rigid resistance to necessary change. Most importantly, the next generation of royal leaders had proven their readiness to inherit institutions that were both historically grounded and practically effective. The whispered conversations in marble hallways had given way to open discussions about the monarchy's future, and that future looked brighter because it would be shaped by leaders who understood that true royal service required both honoring the past and embracing the possibilities of tomorrow. This concludes the 4-part fictional royal drama series. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes.